background in water resources and environmental planning. So in those roles, he helped develop numerous water supply and water conservation projects, wetland and upland habitat restoration projects, including a number of projects in the Sacramento Valley and Delta. He currently serves as the Natural Resources Director for the Conaway Preservation Group, owners of Conaway Ranch. Mr. Buck is a published author in the field of urban water supply reliability planning and received the 1989 Samuel C. May Award from the Western Governmental Research Association for a paper on water marketing in California. He formerly served on the board of directors for the Water Education Foundation. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography, certifications in environmental studies and urban planning, and master's degree in public administration from the California State University, Long Beach. So with that, Byron, you can take it away. I've got the presentation up, and I will change the slides when you say so.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. Good evening, everybody. Sorry I'm not able to join visually. I'm off camping, hopefully with my grandchildren who are supposed to show up tomorrow. So I'm sitting in a rest area with enough bars to make this happen, and hopefully Bill can drive the bus on the presentation, and I'll be able to hear and answer your questions as we go forward. So thanks, Bill, for that introduction. And I appreciate the invite to talk about one of the projects, the major projects we're trying to do at Conaway Ranch, and that is our salmon habitat floodplain reactivation proposal. If you want to go to the next slide, Bill.
Okay.
And this project stems from what we're seeing ecologically within the Sacramento Valley. As I think a lot of people on the call probably understand, the four runs of salmon, spring, fall, late fall, and winter are at historic low levels, with the exception of the fall run, which is supported by hatcheries, because of our man's hydraulic modification of the river system with dams and levees and diversions. And essentially we have re-engineered the Sacramento River for human purposes, and it's actually somewhat remarkable that there's wild anadromous species such as salmon and steelhead that still inhabit the system. And, you know, with the 30 years plus into the Endangered Species Act, a lot's been attempted to recover the species, a number of projects that are successful, but the entire life cycle of the salmon is threatened in many ways. And so it's quite a giant puzzle to try to put together or put back enough of the natural features of the environment to sustain these species. And it's, with climate change, it's a bit of a worry whether this will be able to be done in places like the Sacramento, but nonetheless, a lot of folks are trying, and there's cold water upstream that comes out of springs that, you know, would probably withstand climate change effects, and hopefully we can maintain these native species. But one of the primary things that's happened to the life cycle of the salmon is that we've removed a lot of the wetland and riparian habitat from the system. This slide shows that the Sacramento River in natural systems used to flood frequently and flood out onto the floodplain in the winter and spring. And I'm sure many of you have seen old slides of Sacramento under 15 feet of water. And that was a fairly regular occurrence in the wetter years, that the river systems here act very differently than in the Midwest and other places. And they get big, huge pulses of precipitation in these big atmospheric river events that we get, and they spread out onto the floodplain. The salmon were adapted to that life cycle. The smolts, the baby salmon, would be spawning. They would come down the river. They would pick up those pulse flows when the water spread out onto the floodplain. That was just like a smorgasbord for them. It was a huge area for them to feed, because when the land gets wet, it gets very productive. The microinvertebrates and vertebrates just blossom immediately, and this was part of their life cycle. They would fatten up in these floodplains and wetlands before they would continue on their journey out into the ocean via the delta. Go to the next slide, Bill. This graph
Okay.
kind of tells the story of what we've lost in terms of the extent of Central Valley floodplains that were accessible to the salmon. Looks like historically we had nearly 5,000 square miles of these kind of habitats, and now we're down to less than 500, maybe less than 400. And while we're starting to increase that amount a little bit, we've got a long way to go, and we really only have 10% of this kind of habitat left. A lot of it is pretty degraded. And so, again, it's somewhat remarkable that the salmon, are hanging on when a big part of their life cycle habitat has been essentially extirpated. Next slide.
Okay.
This slide illustrates, why this habitat matters. I mentioned how the fish will go out onto the floodplain and fatten up in a natural environment. What we've done at Conaway and others have done, ranch north of us, the Geary folks, has been to experiment by flooding rice fields in the higher flow events and ponding that water on the fields in the spring for 3 weeks to a month, and we've planted salmon smolts on it to see, does this mimic what happened in nature? And the short answer is yes. In kind of beyond our wildest dreams, the fish really don't care where their food comes from. They just like it when there's food, and flooding the rice fields when they're fallow, that's basically the same land that used to flood before. Microinvertebrates pop right up. Looking at this beaker on the left, that's basically water full of food that the fish like to eat. And on the floodplain, it just explodes versus what's happening in the river, which is rip-wrapped and has lost so much of the riparian habitat and is basically a channel for water supply projects and is really fairly inhospitable. And so the picture on the upper left really shows the difference. If we can get these fish out onto the floodplain to rear, they get bigger and fatter before they go back into, on the receding hydrograph, back into the river and then move down into the system. Bigger, more robust fish are going to have a higher survivability out in the ocean and a higher likelihood, we believe, to return to spawn in the system. So these studies that have been done, a number of them now, really show that this can be a big benefit. It's hard to tell at this scale whether there's a population level effect on returning salmon. And this is something that, if we demonstrate a couple of these big projects, we hope to be able to prove that it's beneficial, that, getting more healthier fish out in the ocean will ultimately mean more and healthier fish will return, 3 to 4 years on their cycle. That's a question still sort of outstanding, but we believe that you've got to kind of put together all the pieces of what the salmon used to have a success here. And so we're trying to do a project that would provide additional floodplain habitat for the salmon in the spring months and winter months. Next slide. So our project, and this is labeled Full Conaway Integrated Floodplain Reactivation Proposal, is really 3 components, all of which could be severable depending upon funding, depending upon staging, regulatory concerns, et cetera. And the 3 components are really a reactivation of the floodplain, where fish can actually move out of the river onto the floodplain, feed and rear, and then find their way back to the river naturally through the drainage. A second part is just a floodplain reactivation where we put water on it, but the fish wouldn't come because of the way we get water on it. The fish wouldn't be in that supply, but we create a huge amount of food production. That then is flushed down into the system, down into the river and the delta. And in theory, the fish would benefit from that because they'd have plenty to eat on their way out to the ocean, which is, it takes a number of weeks. And then the last component is a permanent wetland recreation that would be year-round for fish, for waterfowl and other aquatic species. And that is basically taking what is currently an agricultural supply channel and drainage channel, the Tuleyome Canal, and reimagining it as a more natural wetland corridor. And I'll have some slides coming up on that. The next slide, Bill. This is the location map, just for those of you who may not know where Conaway is and how large it is. It's a nearly 20,000 acre ranch where we currently run mostly rice farming, some alfalfa, some permanent crops, very little of that, frankly. But we also have a number of habitat easements, and the owners are very into wildlife-friendly farming. Taking easements for things like giant garter snake, for the Swainson's hawk, and for the tricolor blackbird. And so this would be kind of another level of us utilizing the land in a way that's still compatible with the rice farming operations, but adding a new component that would essentially be giving back to the environment, returning some of this land in periodic times when the water's there to benefit the salmon. Next slide. So this is our kind of plot plan of our proposal, and it's a pretty busy slide, and I won't try to explain it all. North is at the left here, so it's you kind of have to almost in your mind turn it, but it does depict the three different components, and the blue boxes I'll refer to. The fish food subsidy area, that's this dark crosshatch on the lower side of the slide. That's about 2,000 acres. That's where we would bring water in, flood the land, create a lot of fish food invertebrates that would look like that cloudy beaker you saw earlier, and then eventually drain back into the river via the Tuleyome Canal and be, supplement the food for the salmon. And a lot of other studies have found that the fish are basically starving. They just don't get enough food. They don't get big enough, healthy enough to make their migration, and they're more vulnerable to predation and other things. Second component, the blue box just above that, is the fish rearing and feeding area. This is where the area that would be flooded, that would have fish contained on it. We would basically re-engineer the checks on the fields to be able to hold water at a depth that would be good for the creation of the invertebrates, and deep enough to keep avian predators at bay, hold the fish on for 3 to 4 weeks, and then as the natural hydrograph recedes, we drain these fields and back into the system, and the fish would follow out and continue on their migration. The third component is the top blue box in the upper right, the Tuleyome Canal restoration, and that is a feature on the east side of the Yolo Bypass levee. That's again a drainage canal now, and we would basically widen that out and recontour it into a natural riparian corridor. And the next slide, Bill, sort of starts what that would look like. This plan 1 on the side is just basically an inset of one of the areas, the 1 through 5 that we would do going down through the system. And we're basically widening out the canal, turning it into a more natural riparian habitat that would have different habitat based upon how much water's in the system at any given time. Next slide, Bill. This gives you a little better idea, sort of a cross section of what we would want to do with the Tuleyome Canal portion. And you know what? You can sort of block everything out but the blue canal there today. We do have some riparian habitat, fringe and riparian scrub on the canal today, but it's basically a linear drainage facility. While it's got a lot of use, and that we do get salmon in there, we do get a lot of avian life in there. What we would do here is to reform it and widen it out and have these step functions, whereas water came up in the system, they would get wet, stay wet for a longer period of time, and you'd have a lot more environmental productivity for a whole variety of both native fish and native avian species, and year-round resting and rearing habitat for salmon, because it would be a shady riparian habitat, which mimics what we used to have a lot of in the Sacramento Valley 150 years ago. So that, in essence, is our proposal. Next slide. Where we are these days is these are expensive projects. We're talking about $35 million to do this. It's 6,000 acres, so it's landscape scale. Most of the habitat restoration that's been done in the system is a couple hundred acres here and there. So this is a big bite to do. But given the huge loss of the habitat that's been out there, we think it's appropriate. So we're trying to get the state and federal agencies interested enough to fund it. There is money in the system. We've got some resistance with some of the Fish and Wildlife people, because to move the water up onto the land, we need to put a check structure in Tuley Canal that would operate for a couple of weeks. And they're just generally averse to having any impediments in riverine structures, however temporary, however operable they would be. So we have sort of bifurcated the project to, we can do the Tuley Canal restoration on its own. We don't need a structure there. That might be a place to start while we work through, issues of, can we design something that's fish friendly and still yet, has the function of getting water up onto the floodplain. There is a start on this concept going with the, what's called the Big Notch project, the Yolo bypass notch in the Fremont Weir. That will wet some acreage, but it's really not a fully thought through project in my view, in that it doesn't really deal with downstream land in a way that will really help serve its purpose, which is to provide food for fish. And so our project would piggyback on top of that. That's where the water would come from, down to that Big Notch, but we would spread it on much larger acreages and do it in a way that held the water longer and would have a much higher fish food benefit. But some of the agency folks want to experiment, see what happens with this Yolo bypass Big Notch project. That's going to be 10, 15 years, to prove its worth. And given, tens of thousands of acres of loss of habitat, we feel that bigger measures are needed sooner to really get a jump on salmon restoration. So we're trying to get folks interested in this, and part of that is to present it to folks like you that are out there and talk to people and might be interested in it.
All right. Well, everybody, I encourage you to go to the tuleyome.org website. Check out other events we have going on. There's lots of new hikes that are up on the site, and there'll be more lectures in the future. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again, Byron. All right, bye, everybody.
Bye-bye now.